So I'd like to introduce our last presenter for the session. Greg MacAyeal is the curator of the Northwestern University Music Library, overseeing all collections and services recorded in musical materials. Additionally, he holds an adjunct teaching appointment at Northwestern University's Vienna School of Music, Dominican University, and North Park University in Chicago. And Greg's main research interest is post-war musical experimentalism, in particular the music and writing of John Cage. The Northwestern University Library acquired the Branca archive in 2018, and the paper presented today on neutral records is a direct result of research conducted in that archive. So without further ado, Branca and Josh BAER'S Neutral Noise Finds a Home.
All right, thank you very much. Let me get my slides started here. So hopefully, guys, you can see this. Is that showing?
Yes.
All right.
Good.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Yes, this is really a research born out of my work with this collection, which has been an enjoyable ride, that's for sure. So music scenes are everywhere. Most of us take note of them when an artist gains enough popularity to foster the question, where did they come from? Or who else sounds like that? Or what music are they listening to? Our own interest drives the investigation. Scenes may be entirely invented, however, and there's a Heisenbergian quality at play. The act of observing a scene may be the action that creates it in the first place, or as we will see, maybe kills it. Some communities resist the very notion that scenes exist, and simply showing up somewhere does not make a scene. Will Straw, in his 1991 paper, Systems of Articulation, Logics of Change, Communities and Scenes in Popular Music, states, a musical scene is that cultural space in which a range of musical practices coexist, interacting with each other within a variety of processes of differentiation. For clarity, we may think of musical practices as often including not only a mix of talent and technique, but also roles like performer, audience, curator, promoter, and capitalist. Scenes are the people, places, ideas, expressions, and outputs of a local community. Many scenes remain local, forming shape and size, and ultimately dissolve without much identity as a scene, and some become translocal. The ideas and outputs of a translocal scene then become an incubator of cultural significance. From a small, derelict urban landscape emerged a music and art scene that has made a lasting impact. Giving rise to a kind of alternative music called noise rock, the scene in Lower Manhattan in the late 1970s was an active experimental artist hatchery. One artist, Glenn Branca, assumed nearly every role imaginable within the music scene, and today, for many, is only remembered as a footnote in the story of the rise of noise rock and its defining bands, Sonic Youth and Swans. This paper argues he was important to the music of Lower Manhattan as a translocal influence. Much of my research, like I stated, is informed by my work as the curator of the Glenn Branca archive here at Northwestern, which we acquired shortly after his passing in 2018. All right. Oh, I see. Here we go. Now it started. On June 13th, 1977, New York City went dark. A massive blackout took hold of the city, and for 2 days, putting millions of residents and workers on a forced break. The mid-70s were hard on New York. An $11 billion debt gave the city little opportunity to borrow needed funds to set right a financial tailspin. As musician, actor, and New York City scenester Lydia Lunch reported, New York City in the 1970s was a beautiful, ravaged slag, impoverished and neglected after suffering from decades of abuse and battery. The famous CBGB's Music Club and a few other music venues and galleries hosted a vibrant music and art community bursting forth from the ravaged slag of the Lower East Side. The scene consisted of musicians, visual artists, filmmakers, and performance artists, and each participant in the scene could assume any of these roles. The do-it-yourself and highly collaborative approach was enabled by low rents on large spaces that served as homes, studios, and performance spaces. Many former denizens of the Lower East Side recall living in a high-crime, dilapidated area, but also one that seemed ready to realize any and all artistic visions. Quoting Lydia once again, everyone was doing everything. You painted, you were in a band, you made films, you wrote songs. It was all just so interconnected. We were all friends and freak by nature outsider artists. A 28-year-old playwright and director named Glenn Branca moved to New York City in 1976, but he quickly moved his artistic endeavors from theater to music. Compared to working with hired musicians, Branca found it much easier to create and perform original music for his plays and productions. And eventually his interest in music overtook his interest in theater. Clubs like CBGB's provided the stage needed for Branca and like-minded musicians, and the scene grew to include many bands. A common pool of players created interchangeable lineups. The guitar player in one band was the singer in another and the drummer in a third. The desire to participate was all that mattered, and musical talent was not a prerequisite. The scene found the moniker No Wave. There is uncertainty on the origination of the name itself, but the participants liked the suggestion that the music was not part of anything. Rather proudly, No Wave music claims a connection to nothing and aspires to nothing. It's a self-proclaimed break from the past, making no desire to build on or progress anything. At the height of No Wave in the mid-1970s, Branca fronted two bands, the Static and Theoretical Girls, along with bands DNA, Mars, Teenage Jesus, and the Jerks, to name but a few. Branca and his bands became staples of the club scene. Arriving to this churning musical culture on extended visit in 1978 was Brian Eno. The composer, performer, and music producer was primarily in New York to help master a new record by the Talking Heads. And Eno was attracted to the quote-unquote plurality of cultures, which he saw as distinct from art scenes in the United Kingdom, and he convinced Island Records to record an anthology to document no-wave bands. Never assuming the resulting album would be commercially viable, Eno did feel a need to record the bands as a matter of historical importance. The resulting LP is titled No New York, released on Island in 1978 on the Antilles label. Eno chose only 4 bands, each with a very distinctive style. Not much about the album was pleasing to the artist and scenesters. James Chance of the Contortions said in an interview, as soon as Eno recorded that album, it killed something. No New York documents nothing. Whether Eno's record killed No Wave, the scene was essentially over by the late 1970s, and most of the bands folded or evolved to new styles. However, Eno's record is not the only artifact of no wave music. A few small independent labels released 7-inch singles and a few LPs. Notably were the labels Lust, Unlust, ZE, and 99 Records. Roar, a label owned by club owner Neil Cooper, produced a large cassette series hoping to capitalize on the brand new Sony Walkman. And you can see in this slide, this is the display ad that he published frequently to promote and sell his cassettes. As Branca's bands disintegrated, he began to write works for guitar ensembles, music much better suited for art galleries and concert halls. Still, he used rock elements such as distortion, high volume, and a driving beat. Branca himself had recorded a few 7-inch singles with his no-wave bands, but around 1980 found an interest in recording and promoting the music of others. Along with musician and visual artist Barbara S. and gallery operator Josh Baer, the three created the Just Another Asshole #5 audio anthology. At the time, Baer was the director of an experimental artist space called White Columns in the Tribeca neighborhood. Earlier that year, which would be June in 1981, White Columns was host to a 9-day music festival called Noise Fest. The bands were selected by Thurston Moore, who at around that time founded Sonic Youth along with Kim Gordon and a few other musicians working in the wake of post-No Wave. As Moore and Gordon described it, since No Wave had been killed by Eno's record a few years earlier, Noise Fest brought together people who had previously not known each other but were acutely aware of No Wave music. Where No Wave sought a complete break from the past, this new crop of artists and musicians were building on what they understood to be a rich legacy. Noise Fest and the Just Another Asshole anthology together defined the musicians working at the time. Mars, DNA, and other No Wave bands were replaced with Y Pants, Sonic Youth, Jules Baptiste Red Decade, and more. Glenn Branca was still at the center of this mix and felt that he needed to take an active role in recording and promoting this music. According to rumor, Branca first approached 99 Records with the notion to record some of the noise fest bands, and in particular, Sonic Youth. Label owner Ed Ballman had released Branca's first record of concert music called Lesson Number 1, and the label had success with a few other bands on the scene. To Branca, 99 seemed like a good match. When Ballman declined, Branca talked to Josh Baer back at White Columns, and the two men founded Neutral Records. The first band to issue a recording was Sonic Youth. Now, this slide shows you all of the recordings by Neutral in order from the upper left, which is the first one, down to the lower right, which was the last recording. Between 1982 and 1987, Neutral released 15 phonodisc records. The range of style suggests Branca and Baer were looking to record the scene rather than a sound. This quasi-ethnographic approach puts Neutral on common ground with Brian Eno. In addition to Sonic Youth, Neutral recorded other noise rock bands, Swans, which is down here on the lower left, and Rat at Rat R, which is right next to them. A young Eric Bogosian over here released 2 of his monologues on a record titled Live in London, and No Way filmmakers Beth B. and Scott B. produced and released a soundtrack for their film Vortex. In an interview from 1983, Branca asserts his intent with the label is to get on record a kind of artistic expression that is not viable in the commercial world. He believed the music recorded on his label would appeal to many people. Without his efforts, he felt, they may never learn of it. Again, similar to Eno, Branca and Baer did not expect a high degree of commercial success, but rather felt the label was an important tool to document. All right, and here is a listing of the releases with a little bit more information for you. I'm sorry that previous slide, I could not manage to cram in the titles for those records, so I had to kind of split it up here. Several of the bands utilized a recording studio at Radio City Music Hall called Plaza Sound Studio. The building had fallen into disrepair, and in order to have a revenue stream, the old radio broadcast studio used by Toscanini and the NBC Radio Orchestra was converted for recording. Rates were cheap, and the room was accommodating simply by its size. Other studios utilized includes legendary Noise New York and DC studios. Presently, it's unclear how many units were produced. Small batches, certainly. The only verification I've been able to have is that Neutral 7 by Jack Goldstein, which is a multi-disc recording of musique concrète for use in a gallery installation, had only 50 units made. While it's not entirely clear how Branca and Baer delegated responsibility, it seems clear that the label artists were granted quite a bit of control. In fact, Branca said his single task at the label was to stamp everything for approval. And this appears to be true, and that the archive here at Northwestern consists of correspondence from Baer to Branca telling him to give his approval on a wide range of matters. Since both men were active in the scene that produced the artists they recorded, it's fair to say that artist and repertoire decisions, such as they were, came to conclusion in a collaborative manner. As a sampling of style, I'm going to play a few excerpts. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Sonic Youth, today considered a seminal noise rock band that is frequently mentioned as an inspiration for subsequent indie rock musicians. Swans is another band working within a similar sonic universe. Fronted by Michael Guerra, Swans drew more inspiration from earlier no-wave bands and the concert music of Branca, and their performances were and are notoriously loud. All right, moving on. Barbara S., again of Just Another Asshole fame, formed the band Y Pants with 2 other artists in the scene. Decidedly an outsider art concept, Y Pants commonly used toy instruments to create what she called small music. And the release on Neutral was not their first, as 99 had issued a previous EP, but this album, Beat It Down, was their first full-length album. Composer Michael Gordon is well known in new music circles. As a founding member of the Bang on a Can Festival, his music and advocacy for modern concert music is far-reaching. He formed the Michael Gordon Philharmonic in 1983, and in 1987 recorded 3 works released as Neutral 15, the last record made by the label. Gordon has since recorded for Nonesuch, Cantaloupe, and CRI. This is called Acid Rain. Example is Paul McMahon. Seemingly counter to the noise and art rock offerings of Swans and Y Pants, the first record by Paul McMahon is a compilation of quirky pop songs. McMahon, like so many other artists mentioned in this presentation, was a member in no-wave bands, a performance artist, and a visual artist. And for a time in the mid-70s, he worked at the Artist Space in New York City.
Sleep at night, I roll myself up in a ball so tight. I close the window, shut the blinds, close my eyes, turn off my mind. I've got to concentrate. I've got to concentrate. I've got to make a wish. I've got to make my fate.
That's a catchy one. That's been in my head for weeks now. So across the 15 releases, I put my own categorization in the following manner: 1 spoken word comedy, 1 film soundtrack, 1 audio installation, 5 concert art music, and 7 alternative rock. But these terms are to be understood very broadly and entirely my imposition. The boundary between concert music and rock is particularly blurred and only important in the context of this demonstration. Branca and BAER, in other words, may have made no style or performance-based distinctions. No wave in the music following has been described as living in a borderland of rock and art music, and it's clear to see this reflected in Neutral's offerings. None of it likely to be successful from a sales standpoint, but to echo Branca's intent, all of it possibly finding an audience. The label output is stylistically diverse, born out of the artist working in the scene and giving as much freedom as possible to the artists. According to Paul McMahon, Neutral was the label on the scene. Branca and BAER were well known and they had established paths to producing a record. While very little financing was made available, Neutral did have the ability to book time in a few specific studios, engage producers, and offer distribution. It was the connective tissue that enabled artists to make inroads with parts of the recording industry that may have been inaccessible otherwise. Longtime music industry leader Peter Wright, presently chair of the board of the Archives of Contemporary Music, initially worked to distribute Neutral releases via independent services, including Important, Dutch East, Bonaparte, and New Music Distribution Service. David Rosenblum's Souls of Chaos asserts Neutral Records is distributed by Roar, but no other records indicate this. At least one catalog, which you can see here, created for sales and distribution, was made, but again, as far as unit production, I don't really know how many units were made. Paul McMahon told me that they made only 500 of his records. On September 10th, 1988, Branca and BAER sent a letter to Neutral artists stating their intent to end the label. They say the reasons are due to non-label activities, both Branca and BAER, due to non-label activities of both Branca and BAER and the inability to finance less commercial releases. The letter continues to say all royalty commitments will be upheld, remaining stock sold, all production material, master recordings, and original artwork will be returned to the artist and all rights returned after 1 year. One last project was underway at the time of Neutral's closing. Composer Charlemagne Palestine recorded a series of solo piano works on a Bosendorfer 290 SE in April of 1988. These recordings were not released by Neutral, but in keeping with the promise of the closing letter, Palestine regained ownership of the recordings and was finally able to release them on CD 10 years later on the Dutch label Baroni. The final act of the label is a continuation of the artist-centered approach. Rather than seek a buyer for the label assets, Branca and BAER reverted all holdings back to the artist. This is a confirmation and indication of the stated intent to document a scene in all its diversity for the sake of the artist and possible audiences. So very quickly, I know I'm running out of time here. This slide just shows which releases by Neutral were found life afterward through commercial reissue, or which of the artists have loaded some of their material onto their own supported websites. As you can see, about half of it has been reissued. There's still quite a bit that you can find on eBay or other sites like that, but otherwise it doesn't live really anywhere else. All right, in closing here, the strength of the small Neutral catalog lies in the fact that both Glenn and Josh had enjoyed strong roles in the no-wave scene, and before embarking on creating a label, or let me restate that, they enjoyed strong roles in the no-wave scene before embarking on creating a label. As they gained expertise, the do-it-yourself approach evolved to a professionalism that enabled a high-quality product. They kept a focus on the artist with small rewards for the label itself, and in doing so, the two men kept a secure place for Neutral as part of the scene. They were not out-of-towners. They did not line their pockets with the labor of the artist. They controlled the label assets only so far as to help find an audience. When it was over, they gave everything back. The 15 releases allow a close look at the avant-garde as it was being expressed in Lower Manhattan at the time. Finally, as a launching pad for Sonic Youth, Swans, and other noise rock, Neutral should be remembered in particular for finding the audience. And separately, Glenn Branca as an artist can be remembered for establishing the noise rock sound. While Branca was not the only musician working with rock idioms in a concert setting, he found the audience and brought more than just his music to the world. As a final tribute to Branca's impact, Thurston Moore's 2019 Spirit Council includes a 30-minute tribute to Branca called 8 Spring Street. It's clear that Branca's ideas are still generating new modes of expression, not just with his own music, but in the elevation of music around him. And that is my presentation.
Thanks, Greg. Lot of love for particularly Y Pants in the chat, but also Neutral in general. A lot of comments. Love this. And I have a couple questions from our conference manager, program chair, Terry Brendigar. She wanted to know how popular these records were. Did they sell? Or were there sort of a lot left over after the label collapsed?
Yeah, well, I haven't been able to find any specific information about sales, but Peter Wright did confirm that they did have a distribution plan in place. And I'm not sure how beyond New York those records really became, but certainly Sonic Youth and Swans were picked up, and some other bands like that. But I have a feeling it didn't really sell very well. And you know, in Branca and BAER'S last letter saying they essentially don't have the finances to continue, maybe that confirms that.
And that was sort of Terry's other question. Was this sort of very local to the New York area as far as the artists and the marketing?
Yeah, I know Branca toured extensively. So did Sonic Youth and Swans. Again, those were the ones that really kind of made it out. But I don't think a lot of other artists really continued on. Paul McMahon moved away from music, as did Barbara S. What else? I think Red at Red R was another well-known noise rock band at the time, but they sort of fizzled out not too long after that as well. So I think it was very much a sort of time and place label. So I think a lot of the artists sort of dispersed and moved on to other things in a very similar way to the way No Wave kind of evolved and kind of dispersed very quickly.
And I was actually interested in those No Wave cassettes. I was wondering sort of the venue for that ad, you know, where was that placed, sort of in zines or newspapers? Right.
The owner of that label, who I think I'm going to have to go back here just to remind myself, he had been working as a music industry, in the music industry for a long time, and had a lot of paths for distribution. So if I can find his name here, he owned a club in New York City, and that was the basis for that particular label. He talked the bands into allowing him to make recordings, and I'm not sure what kind of deals he made or did not make with the actual labels that owned those recordings, but he produced him themselves and sold them through zines and magazines and that kind of thing. Roar is still around. It really kind of grew into a much larger label that encompasses not only this kind of early 80s New York based rock, but it's become much more of a important label for alternative rock music in particular, and hip hop too.
I was also curious about the sort of the collapsing, Brian Eno recorded them and he killed No Wave. Do you get the sense that it was because it was Brian Eno, because of him, because it was sort of a major label release, or was it just the act of being recorded?
That's a great question. And what I've read from testimonies of so many of the musicians and artists at the time was they became pretty angry with Eno in the process. So he showed up and he was going to produce this record for the Talking Heads, and was in New York and heard all these bands and was apparently blown away by the scene. And anecdotally, I guess he made a lot of promises to artists like, oh yeah, I'm going to record you, I'll record all of your stuff, it's going to be this great thing. And then ultimately he did a lot of gatekeeping on what was produced. And I think to an extent that maybe angered a lot of the people within the scene. But again, by the time he pushed that record out, a lot of the artists were already beginning to move in other directions anyway. So, it's the scenesters and musicians claim that it killed the scene. I don't know if it really did, but in a sense of maybe putting a label on it and angering the musicians around it, it may have contributed in some way. As I said in the beginning of this, the no wave artists and musicians really very purposefully wanted to be thought of as not being a part of anything else, not wanting to be building on something that was a real break from the past. And maybe having a major label and someone like Brian Eno that certainly could have contributed to this feeling that they were becoming part of something and they did not want to do that.
And one final question. Jeff Willens wants to know if Ike Yard was ever involved with Neutral Records.
What's the name?
Ike Yard.
That's not a name I have seen so far.
And another question of if this genre ever crossed over with the post-punk scene, especially in New York.
I guess I don't feel like I know enough about the post-punk scene in New York to know that, but I know Swans in particular is kind of thought of as seminal band leading to that as a genre. But I think certainly some of the Neutral releases, assuming they were around in New York through the 80s and maybe through the early 90s, would be part of that musical landscape that might help contribute to post-punk.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for a great session. For all of you, thank you for joining us. And I want to reiterate some of the statements that were made earlier this morning. If you'd like to get involved with ARSC, we have plenty of positions open for volunteers. Check the ARSC website for our call for volunteers. If you're not a member, lots of great benefits. I think you've seen some of those in this session, that a lot of people with a lot of diverse knowledge that are always happy for you to research and have you reach out to them. Look for everybody in the lounge and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks so much.